In 1759, an English gentleman named Thomas Pritchard sat down to a breakfast of eggs, toast, and coffee. Nothing unusual, except that his coffee beans had been roasted aboard a ship carrying a lodestone compass that misbehaved spectacularly after a solar flare 3 days prior. Thomas didn't know that. He only noticed that his spoon kept twitching toward his neighbor's fork, which he took as a sign of mild demonic interference, or possibly poor metallurgy. Somewhere between his saucer and the sun, the universe gave its spoon a twist. That solar flare, a fit of electromagnetic temperament from a sunspot near the equator, brushed Earth's magnetic skin just enough to nudge migratory birds off course across the Atlantic. Fewer seabirds meant more locusts survived in the African Sahel that year. More locusts meant famine murmurs in the Ottoman provinces. Ottoman grain traders raised prices. British speculators reacted. Coffee shipments soared in value. Thomas Pritchard, reading this in the London Gazette, decided to buy more beans. While he congratulated himself on his prescient investment, his gut bacteria were staging a quiet symposium. The particular strain of Bifidobacterium longum thriving in his intestines that morning traced its lineage to an ancestor carried by Indonesian sailors centuries before. As they feasted on his toast, they released trace molecules that tilted his mood just enough to make him unusually generous toward a local radical pamphleteer. By noon, Thomas had funded the first printing of an essay on celestial sympathies and social harmony, a text historians now credit as a pre-Darwinian glimmer of systems theory, though Thomas only wanted to impress a woman who liked astrology. Meanwhile, Jupiter was entering opposition, a planetary gesture so distant and slow it might as well have been a polite nod. Yet its gravitational tug shifted the Bristol Channel tides by a few seconds. That slight delay changed the moisture balance in local salt flats, where workers were boiling brine. The resulting batch of subtly purer salt found its way, through a labyrinth of trade, into the butter spread on Thomas's toast. The very toast that fed the microbes that bent his mood, that funded the pamphlet, that seeded an idea that would someday help build the machinery of cybernetics. By the time the last crumb dissolved, the breakfast table had become a kind of quiet observatory. Forks and planets kept their own invisible choreography. Yeast and Jupiter pulsed to the same inaudible rhythm. The world was tuning itself through him, though he only tasted butter. By evening, he merely noted a mild heaviness and the satisfaction of a profitable day. He went to bed certain that fortune favored the diligent. Yet far above, the solar wind still trembled from that earlier flare, and deep within, his microbes were composing the next stanza of civilization's accidental poem. He never knew the scale of the concert he'd joined, how each swallow drew an echo from the sky, how the salt on his tongue rhymed with the tides. But somewhere in that unnoticed synchrony, history leaned infinitesimally toward what would come next. The faint aftertaste of a universe rehearsing its own reflection. On the Dorset coast in 1811, the morning mist still clung to the limestone cliffs when Mary Anning's rubber boots sank into the tidal mudflats. She bent to pick up a stone etched with spiral patterns, and as her fingertips brushed the ammonite shell, she suddenly thought of the needle her mother had used to mend socks the night before. The way the metal tip had pierced the fabric felt strangely like how the rock now held the fossil, as if both were woven from the same quiet logic. No one called this 12-year-old girl a scientist. She was just the poor stone-picking lass. But the ammonite in her palm was speaking in shapes older than time. The Fibonacci sequence hidden in its spiral radius matched the number of mussels she'd counted that morning, the curve of the clouds drifting overhead, all part of a wordless equation. She had no magnifying glass, so she squinted at the stone in the sunlight. A grain of quartz was wedged in the fossil's crack. When light filtered through it, tiny flecks of brightness fell on the bruise on her wrist, left by a crate of fish she'd helped her father unload the week before. Suddenly, that grain of sand felt busy. It had once been part of an ancient riverbed, rounded by currents, buried by geologic shifts, and now, through her gaze, it saw the sun again. And her gaze carried the faint glow of last night's kerosene lamp, the flame's energy traced back to coal formed from rotting ferns 300 million years ago. Those ferns had fed on insects, whose wing beats now hummed in quiet harmony with the crash of distant waves. "Mary, stop dawdling!" Her mother's shout drifted down from the cliffs, scattering a flock of silver gulls. The arc of their wings cutting through the air reminded her of the angel wings on the church's stained glass windows she'd seen yesterday. Both curves, both defying gravity, both the same urge to rise. She tucked the ammonite into her canvas bag, which already held half a loaf of rye bread, a rusted chisel, and an ichthyosaur vertebra she'd found the day before. The vertebra's joint was smooth. She scraped it with her fingernail, and the debris fell to the mud, soon carried away by the rising tide. Those fragments would merge with the ocean currents, maybe swallowed by a krill, which a mackerel would eat, which would end up on a restaurant plate in London. And the person eating it might hold a book debating natural laws, never knowing they were chewing the memory of the sea she now stood in. By noon, the sun had burned off the mist, and she spotted a rock embedded with an ichthyosaur tooth beneath the cliff. When she struck it with the chisel, sparks flew, and one shard landed in her collar. She reached to brush it away, and the moment her fingertip touched her skin, a thought clicked. The reason she could feel the shard's warmth was because nerve endings under her skin sent signals, powered by the flow of sodium and potassium ions. The force holding protons and neutrons together in those ions' nuclei was the same force that kept galaxies spinning. Both were just efforts to hold things together. The calcium atoms in the ichthyosaur tooth's enamel followed the same crystalline logic as the calcium carbonate in her mother's pearl brooch. One hidden in a million-year-old rock, the other pinned to her mother's dress for market days. Her canvas bag was heavy by the time she walked home at dusk. Passing the blacksmith's shop, she watched him hammer a red-hot iron bar into a horseshoe. Sparks fell to the ground, cooling quickly into black flecks. She thought of the ichthyosaur tooth sheen, and suddenly hot and cold, soft and hard, felt less fixed. Iron softened in heat, just as the ammonite in her palm had once been a living, soft-bodied creature, now harder than stone. Her own bones, which held her up now, would turn to soil in 100 years, maybe absorbed by a new plant, eaten by an insect, and become a trace in a fossil, just like the one she found today. Before bed, she placed the ammonite beside her pillow. Moonlight filtered through the broken window onto the fossil, and the shadow of its spiral fell across her open notebook. She couldn't read or write, so she drew the fossil with charcoal. As she sketched, she suddenly felt her hand wasn't hers alone. The bones in this hand carried her parents' genes, which held memories of ancient primates. The charcoal she held came from a felled oak, whose rings recorded rainfall from the past decade, and the spiral she drew matched the shape of Orion's arm in the night sky, the spiral of yeast in her rye bread, the spiral of thread her mother used to mend socks, all the same urge to persist. She didn't know the word consciousness or free will. She only knew she'd go back to the beach for stones tomorrow. When she closed her eyes, she could still hear the waves, a sound that held the ichthyosaur's ancient breaths, the gull's wing beats, the blacksmith's cooling sparks, and the thud of her own heart. All these sounds tangled into a vast web, and she wasn't an observer outside it. She was a thread in its mesh, pulled by other threads, pulling them in turn. That night, she dreamed she was a grain of quartz, drifting in an ancient ocean, swallowed by an ichthyosaur, excreted in its waste, buried in sand, turned to stone, and finally picked up by a hand just like her own. When she woke, she touched the ammonite beside her pillow. It was still cold, but suddenly she felt the fossil wasn't dead, and she wasn't alone. Like the blacksmith's iron, the yeast in her bread, the stars in the sky, they were all characters in the same story. No one was more important. No one was passive. The mystery had never been in distant stars or deep underground. It was in the moment her finger touched the fossil, in the blacksmith's flying sparks, in the stitches of her mother's mending, in every second when things and people touched and changed each other.